So on the design, we can see that when I click on the image icon, this display uses a grid display, and when I click on the list icon, it shows it as a list. We also want to show that this button is pressed when you click on it, so we need to change that attribute so that our styling can kick in. And so the best way for us to do that is to have a property that drives this for us, that tells us what our current display state is. So if our current display state is grid, then this UL needs to display like a grid, and this button needs to show as pressed. And then if I click on the list, the UL needs to show that it's a list, and the button needs to show that it is pressed. So step one for us is just to set up the click events for this, and we're going to use the binding engine to do that. So to start off with, we need to actually give these buttons IDs because we're going to need that for testability. So let's just do that quick. So we'll say this is ID equals btn for button, and we'll say that this list, and in this case this is ID equals to btn grid. And now when I click on this button, I want to set that binding property. So I can say click.setValue, and then I want to say I want to create a property on the binding context called display status. And display status needs to be a list when I click on the list button, and then when I click on the grid button, I want this to show as a grid. So to see that this is working, let's just quickly copy that, and then we go to our JavaScript and we say display status changed, and that'll pass on a new value for us. And we're just going to say console.log new value, and let's go and test it. So on the browser, we're going to click on the grid button, and we see grid at the console log, and we click on the list button and we see list. So we know that our set value is set up correctly now. So now we can go and listen to that property changed on the button and change the attribute for the pressed accordingly. Up to this point, we had this aria pressed hard-coded, but we now want to use a conditional attribute to change this to respond according to the display status. Let's put an if statement on this. So we say this attribute, if the display status is equal to list, then I want this value to be true, else I want this value to be false. We'll save that and first go and test it in the browser. Refreshing the browser, we see now that the default styling is off, and when I click on the grid, it still doesn't show because the default status is now grid. But when I click on the list button, I can see that it's list and the styling now applies. So on the one button where we had that conditional statement, that is working, and if I go to the aria pressed attribute on it, when I change, you can see that that value changes. All we now need to do is go and repeat that logic on the grid button as well. Let us copy and paste our statement here, and we'll stick it in the same place as well. And now we want to just change this one part to say if the display status is grid, I want this to be true, else I want this to be false. And let's go and have a look. In our browser, we'll just refresh. We click on list and the list is highlighted. We click on the grid and the grid is highlighted. And as expected, the aria pressed behaves accordingly. So now that's fine, except for the fact that when I start with this, there's no default state. And since the list is the first item in the list and is also the cheapest item to render, we want list to be the default display status. And to do that, we need to go and set some code in the preloading function. Going to our JavaScript, we can add a function in here called preload, and if you know your binding engine stuff, you'll know what this means. And we'll just say this.setProperty display status is equal to list, and that's it. Going back to the browser and refreshing, you can now see that this button is by default list, and when I refresh, you can also see the list comment coming out here from our status that has changed. So everything on this is functioning perfectly now. What we need to do next is to change the way that this UL displays depending on whether we want to have a list or a grid. But the first thing is just to go and add the final touches to our list here so that it looks like it was on the design.